Time for you to rethink.
You know the word annihilate? It means reduced to nothing.
Perished means killed.
We know what perished means.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us for Rethinking Hell Live, where evangelical Christians discuss what the Bible says about hell and put conventional and controversial views to the test. Join the discussion in YouTube's live chat or email your feedback, questions, and episode suggestions to live@rethinkinghell.com. Rethinking Hell is on Facebook as well, and be sure to check us out on Patreon if you'd like to become a supporter of the show. See the description below for all links and details, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for future updates.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Rethinking Hell Live. My name is Chris Date, and on the other side of the screen is William Tanksley. How you doing, William? It's good to see you again.
Howdy, doing great. You too?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thanks. Summer is rolling along. Work is going well. Ministry is going okay. Yeah, things are progressing. Still trudging along in the book that I'm co-editing with Paul Copan. Having some issues with the final contributions, so trying to work through those. But yeah, things are good. How about you? Anything going on in your life?
Nothing. Yeah, nothing really notable. It's things are just rolling in the groove.
Awesome. Well, as viewers first of all, let me say, viewers, if you appreciate what we here at Rethinking Hell do, we'd very much appreciate you doing the things on YouTube that allow our channel to receive more visibility. So if you enjoy this video when it's over, and we do encourage you to please watch the whole video, that is one step that helps us out in the algorithm. When you're done watching it, if you enjoyed it, click like. That would help us a lot. Subscribing to our channel helps, and clicking the notification bell so that you get alerted whenever we schedule new streams or upload new videos. That helps as well. So we'd appreciate you doing all of that. Also, your comments help, sharing, all those kinds of things. And then the other thing I just want to mention is that we at Rethinking Hell are, at least for the time being, entirely donation funded. We don't sell advertising. Our channel isn't monetized, any of that kind of stuff. We rely entirely upon you, our friends and fans. Thank you, Study is Key, for letting me know that audio and video are good. We rely on you, our friends and fans, to keep us afloat, and we'd very much appreciate your continued support. And so if that's something that you can do, either with a one-time or periodic or recurring donation, go to rethinkinghell.com/donate, I want to say, or maybe rethinkinghell.com/PayPal. It's probably donate. Or go to patreon.com/rethinkinghell and become a patron. You could just go to rethinkinghell.com and scroll to where the donate button or PayPal button is and get to it that way. But we'd very much appreciate your help. With all of that housekeeping out of the way, let's remind viewers of what we're doing in this series. Viewers, if they've seen the thumbnail for today's episode, will see that this is responding to Thomas Farrar part 4, which suggests that we've done 3 parts of this series already. Why don't you tell us what we've done in this series so far and what we might be able to expect today, William?
So starting with Rethinking Hell Live episode 111, we've been responding to Thomas Farrar's pair of videos titled Against Annihilationism. Farrar is a Catholic who converted from a conditionalist group, and he has a genuine, a unique level of compassion and understanding of our view, which shows in his analysis. He's also extremely well educated and thoughtful, which shows as he produces very clearly stated objections to our view. The video interview that we're discussing over the past, this total so far of 4 episodes, and there will be more in the future.
It's a lot of material to respond to.
It is. And plus, we seem to just really enjoy producing long form video content.
We do.
And audio, back when we did that. His video is a guide through a paper he wrote, which is a critical review of Edward Fudge's book, A Consuming Fire, which we continue to recommend. The book, I mean.
You mean the fire that consumes? I think you accidentally mixed up a consuming passion, which is the second book that we did, with the title of Edward Fudge's book, The Fire That Consumes. No,
I sure did.
Okay.
Yes. And the fun thing is that this is one of the few attempts to review the third and final edition of that book.
Yeah.
So it's important. Many of the other interactions were just with the first edition. So, and that third edition has a lot of clarifying feedback. So, I know Edward would have liked to have seen this engagement.
He would have.
Yeah. I have to say, Farrar's paper and videos are each good in their own right. As people who are interested in thinking about hell, rethinking hell, I recommend them as a study tool. Chris and I obviously disagree with him, but it's fantastic that people are thinking about hell. It's in our group's name, so how can we discourage that? So anyway, feel free to read his paper, watch his videos. Keep in mind that our review of his videos is not presented in the same order he presents it, because I found his ideas so interesting. I organized my outline to present his ideas by major point by major point, rather than so hopefully I've done a good job, but if you watch his video, you will find a new perspective that, of course, will be more what he presented. He presented it. Yeah, yay. So to resume what we're looking at, our first two videos were on the Old Testament and intertestamental literature. And we looked at the last video we did, New Testament. That's going to continue to be the focus, but specifically we're continuing, we stopped while looking at the name Gehenna. And we're going to be continuing with that on this as we start up this next discussion.
All right. Well, I think that sets the stage, and I think we're ready to go. Do you want me to go ahead and start with our first clip?
Let's do it.
All right.
And as we mentioned in the previous episode, Mark also associates Gehenna with Isaiah 66:24 from the Septuagint.
All right. So that was a short first clip to get us started. What were your what did you want to comment on there?
Certainly true. With that said, a bit of a technical note. There are some places where we know for sure Jesus is quoting from the Septuagint, which is a ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament. We know that because he uses a turn of phrase that's not a natural translation of the Hebrew, but is present in the Septuagint. And so there's no reason to expect he got that from somewhere else, or that he translated it himself and came up with that rendering. When Christ reads from Isaiah in his sermon in a synagogue in Nazareth, he quotes a phrase that's added to the Septuagint and is not present in our Hebrew. So that tells us what he's reading from. So when Farrar says that this is from the Septuagint, unfortunately, it's not that clear. The Septuagint there simply uses a natural translation of the Hebrew, so we can't tell, we can't be sure. But many rabbinical experts have opined that whatever the source for the words was, Jesus's quote in Mark 9 is actually inspired from the Targum, or from the same tradition of teaching as the Targum of Isaiah, which is unique because it actually uses the word Gehenna in the description of that valley that appears in Isaiah. You can check out an expert in an expert in the Targums, Dr. Craig Evans, gave a seminar on this in Rethinking Hell's 2018 conference. You can type that in, Rethinking Hell 2018 conference, Craig Evans, and you'll get his conference presentation where he discusses that Targum. It was fascinating.
It was a very fascinating talk, especially given that I don't think any of us knew going into that Craig Evans was essentially going to affirm a conditionalist view. That was, I think, a surprise to a lot of us, but a very pleasant one. Just to unpack a little bit, a couple of the things you mentioned there, not unpack, but I guess substantiate a little bit more. You mentioned that it doesn't, in fact, appear as if Mark and or Jesus is actually quoting the Septuagint. And just so that viewers see evidence for this, the Mark 9:48 reads "Haskolanx auton u teluta." That's the first clause. Their worm will not die. But in the Septuagint, it's "Haskolanx auton u telutesi," or telutese. So we've got a different verb form there. And then in the second clause, where Mark 9:48 has "kai tapur u sbenutai," the Septuagint has "kai tapur auton u spesthesetai." So there you've got the missing their worm, their fire, and naturally, or probably for similar reasons as the first clause, the verb form is different. So we've got at least two differences between Mark 9:48 and the Septuagint, it seems to me. And meanwhile, two things stand out to me about the Targum that you mentioned. Targum Isaiah 66:24 does have their fire, like Mark 9:48 does, whereas the Septuagint does not. And like you pointed,
the other way around, doesn't the Targum?
Yeah, you're right. No, Targum has their fire, just like this. You're right, just like the Septuagint does.
Yeah,
but Mark 9:48 does not. So, and then, like you said, the Targum version of the verse ends with "the wicked shall be judged in Gehenna," etc., etc. So we've got not only differences between Mark 9:48 and the Septuagint, suggesting he's not directly quoting it, but you've also got indications in the Targum Isaiah that suggests that is at the very least equally inspiring to Mark 9:48 as the Septuagint, if not more so.
Just a quick note, when we say inspiring, we do not mean that he's quoting it.
Right.
Because he's definitely not quoting the Targum. We've left out some details we'll come to later. The Targum replaces the worm with the concept of their soul.
Mm-hmm.
So he can't be quoting the Targum that we have now. He might have been quoting an unknown Targum that we don't have anymore, but that's speculation. He's definitely thinking of the same concept that the Hebrew and Greek are talking about, though.
Sure. And before we move on to the next clip, is there any importance to this clarification we're offering, or are we just kind of trying to be precise or pedantic or something?
We are geeking out to some extent. We are going to be seeing more about the Targums in just a little bit. And so I wanted to pull this in here. But just to be clear, there's nothing wrong with saying that he's definitely quoting from Isaiah, whether it comes from the Septuagint, whether it's inspired by the Septuagint or by the Hebrew, it's not so important, but that it mixes in the Targums is going to become important.
Gotcha.
In a few points.
Few clips. Okay.
Yeah.
We good to continue then?
Absolutely.
And the quotation shows that this passage, where the fire that will not be quenched burns month after month and Sabbath after Sabbath, is the source of Mark's term unquenchable fire. In the Greek, that's ta pura, ta asbestos. This calls into question Fudge's claim that asbestos means only that the fire will burn unstoppably until its fuel is consumed, because Mark is taking this adjective, which is translated unquenchable in most English Bibles. He's taking it from the Septuagint, where that fire is said to burn month after month and Sabbath after Sabbath, which is not, the period of a normal physical fire, how long it would burn.
All right, so here Thomas is claiming that the word unquenchable, which is in the Greek asbestos, it's actually the accent I think is on the antepenult, so asbestos. But he's claiming that word must mean not merely unstoppable, inextinguishable, but like ever burning, right? Never undying, right? And the reason he's offered is because allegedly, that's a key word, allegedly Isaiah 66:24 in the Septuagint says that the fire that burns them, their fire, will burn from generation to generation, from new moon to new moon, and from Sabbath to Sabbath, or whatever. So what do you make of that claim?
Well, I took down two notes. One I want to brush by really quickly, and that is that Fudge actually seems to be saying that this means the fire will go out after it finishes consuming. And that's not correct. You and I
it's unstated.
Maybe,
yeah.
But it doesn't actually say it. So unstated is one way of saying it doesn't say it, but it sounds like it's an unstated assumption, which we don't know. And I would say in this context, it can't be the case. Because we just said that the fire is eternal. And something that we say is eternal would have to have a very strong statement to say that it then goes out. I don't know if we'll have a chance to really look at that, but I can point to, we discussed this at the very end of the last session. In episode 112, I believe.
Okay, but before you evaluate the Farrar's claim that that Isaiah says that the fires will burn from new moon to new moon and from Sabbath to Sabbath, and that therefore asbestos must mean ever burning or something like that. But before you evaluate that claim, I do just want to point out that the conditionalist, what the conditionalist is really trying to assert about this expression that their fire will not be quenched isn't so much that the fire doesn't burn forever, but rather that the things it burns don't burn forever. And that's a really key distinction, because in the other places we can find this idiom used, it is exactly that. It's a fire which, whether it keeps burning or not, completely devours that which it burns. So
that is exactly true. That's key.
Yeah, so for example, in Ezekiel 20, 47 to 48, God tells Ezekiel to say, "Behold, I'm about to kindle a fire in you, and it will consume," or devour, "every green tree in you and every dry tree. The blazing flame will not be quenched. All flesh will see that I, the Lord, have kindled it. It shall not be quenched." Another example, Exodus 3:2 says that Moses saw the bush burning, kaio, but it was not quenched. Katakayo, or sorry, it was not. Sorry, I'm trying to paraphrase some points I made in an article I wrote a long time ago, and I mixed myself up a little bit. The Exodus 3:2 thing there was just to show that consume means to burn down, right? To reduce to ash. But the point I'm making is that in Ezekiel 20, 47 to 48, another example is Jeremiah 17:27, Amos 5:6 is another example. These are all places where that same expression, the fire won't be quenched, in the context of God's fiery wrath, and that's what we're talking about here. And in those places, this unquenchable fire is said to devour or consume, using language that means to burn down to ashes. So the point we're trying to make here, just to get us started, isn't that the text does or does not say the fire goes on burning. That's not really our point. Rather, our point is that the expression, the idiom, doesn't communicate that the thing being burned remains burning forever, but rather that the thing that is being burned by unquenchable fire is, because it's unquenchable, completely devoured. Is that fair?
That's perfect. Yes.
Okay.
I can also give another example. Matthew 3:12 is nice because it's in the New Testament, and that says the coming one and then it lapses into a metaphor. It says, he will utterly clear his threshing floor. He will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. You picture chaff being shoveled into a jet engine's, output.
We might imagine that. I
gone.
doubt that first century Jews would have, but
Well, and my point
Yeah.
there is simply that unquenchable as an intensifier does not result in the chaff being tormented, if that would even make sense. But this direct use in that metaphor means it is compatible with the metaphor. You
Right.
can burn chaff in an unquenchable fire.
right. So then with that in mind, is Farrar correct that Isaiah says the fire will burn from new moon to new moon and from Sabbath to Sabbath, and that therefore should we take pistos to mean ever burning?
Yes. Would you mind? Let's see. Would you mind turning to that verse? Just
yeah. So Isaiah 60. Well, here I'll copy it and put it up on the
nice
on the screen.
And while you're doing that, so what I'm going to claim is that the month-to-month language in that verse is only attached to the worship. The going out to see the wicked is added to that. It's a simple future prophecy without any sign of a duration. And we can actually confirm that by looking for ancient commentaries, writers who spoke on that. The Talmud speculates or says that the corpses last a year. Well, the worship continues forever. And the Targums, and that may have influenced the Talmud, the Targums that we mentioned before say that the corpses being punished by fire, or rather, the punishment of fire lasts until the righteous say, we have seen enough. And again, the worship itself lasts forever.
Okay.
So there's not such a clear connection there, and there may not actually be this may not be saying that they keep going out and seeing corpses there, although maybe it does. That
so let's
affect our view.
so let's look at the text just to make sure people know what we're talking about. So Isaiah 66:22, for as the new heavens and the new earth that I make shall remain before me, says the Lord, so shall your offspring and your name remain. From new moon to new moon and from Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh shall come to worship before me, declares the Lord. And then the very next verse is, and they, that is the ones who are going out and worshiping before God from new moon to new moon and from Sabbath to Sabbath, they shall go out and look on the dead bodies of the men who rebelled against me, etc. So what Farrar is assuming is that last verse 24 is talking about a process of observing lasting corpses, or I guess he might say, lasting torment. Farrar, that is. He's assuming that verse 24's description of them seeing these corpses or these tormented people is a continuation of verses 22 and 23, which describes this, perennial worship. Perennial is not the right word. Repeated worship. But here's what's interesting. At least the ESV offsets verses 22 and 23 as if they are a unit, a poetic unit. And then, whereas before it and then after it in verse 24 are both straightforward prose. Just really quick, I want to see if there are other translations that do likewise. And it's mixed. Some do, some don't. The RSV, for example, likewise offsets verses 22 and 23 as distinct from the verses before and after. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that it appears as though he's assuming that the perpetual practice described in verses 22 and 23 just continues being described in 24 and describes continued observation of the corpses. But are you saying that assumption isn't necessarily justified?
It's not. Yeah, exactly. It's not a given. There are some clues in the grammar that some people have interpreted one way and some have taken another, like the fact that the "and" between the last two verses is a sequential and. It's a while consecutive, which means that, you have a sequence of events. Worship comes first and then going out to look on the corpses. But of course, it can't mean that endless worship comes first and then you go out and look on the corpses. It must mean that you go to worship and then look on the corpses. And there's no statement of, that does happen elsewhere, where you have a continued long thing and then just something that happens.
Well, and you can have a poetic interjection as well, and then a continuation of the prose, right? And that's what it looks like to me, just based on the way that some translations offset verses 22 and 23. It looks like you've got predictive prose, just straightforwardly describing an eschatological prophetic scene. And then you've got this 2-verse poetic interjection in verses 22 and 23, and then it seems to return to the straightforward prose describing this eschatological scene. But of course, I'm making that's every bit as much a subjective way of looking at it for me as what Farrar seems to be assuming.
Yes, and that's what it comes down to. Maybe we can look at all these ancient commentaries and say, well, they thought it was this way. We can say, but that might not be it. In the end, it kind of doesn't matter. We can also look at Jeremiah 31:40, which says that this valley of corpses and ashes, at some time, once the new Jerusalem is established, the new covenant Jerusalem, excuse me, it's not exactly called the new Jerusalem, but once it's established and rebuilt with its walls enormously expanded around the site of Gehenna to include it, it's called, again, the Valley of Corpses and Ashes. It's not named as Gehenna. That place will be preserved and will never be overturned.
Yeah, the ESV says that it shall be sacred to the Lord and shall not be plucked up or overthrown anymore forever. So it sounds like you're saying that this is at least a possible, this might be support for a notion that the corpses of God's slain enemies do indeed remain in the Valley of Hinnom as some kind of monument or memorial.
Or at least the valley itself will remain.
Right.
And it's called the Valley of Corpses and Ashes. I doubt corpses or ashes will remain, except as, a light trace.
Yeah. Well, and just one last point on this Greek word asbestos. You already made this point, but I just want to emphasize it. Farrar seems to be hinging a lot on this word asbestos as meaning ever burning, and he thinks Isaiah's language of this perpetual worship supports that. But that very same word asbestos is used only 2 other times in the New Testament, and in both cases that asbestos fire completely devours. So Matthew 3:12 and Luke 3:17, they're parallels of each other, but in both cases Jesus says the chaff will be that Jesus will katakaio, burn down, burn up, reduce to ashes, the chaff with asbestos fire. So I would find it it seems to me to strain credulity to suggest that asbestos means a fire in which people burn perpetually in 1 out of 3 places in the New Testament, but both other places that fire burns up. It seems a little bit unlikely to me. That's fair. Anything you want to say more on this clip before we continue?
Just maybe a little comment that this fire is also said to be, it's the eternal fire previously in the passage, and when we come down and we see it here, it is the fire will not be quenched, which kind of suggests it's talking about the same fire, right? The use of the article includes saying, yeah, that one I was talking about up there.
Right.
That's just a thought that this is intended to be coherent together. And I want to kind of use that as an opportunity to warn us conditionalists, don't stretch too far just because that unquenchable fire doesn't say the eternal fire. We shouldn't assume that it's not talking about the same thing. I actually think it is. I think it's the same fire.
Yeah, and just to remind listeners of how we propose eternal fire, in a conditionalist understanding would make sense. Think of the think of the example of a flamethrower. You've lit a flamethrower and you've got a flame burning at the end of your barrel. You then pull the trigger to shoot a stream of flammable liquid through the barrel toward your target of, say, a pile of foliage that you want to burn up. And foliage. I think I'm in the habit of pronouncing it in the minority pronunciation, foliage. So anyway, when you pull that trigger, the stream of flammable liquid that comes through the barrel gets lit by the flame at the end of it, and then the stream of fire catches the pile of foliage on fire. And then you let go of the trigger, and that stream of fire dissipates and retreats back to just the flame that is burning at the end of your barrel. The fire that is burning your pile of foliage eventually goes out when it's reduced to ashes, but the fire at its source, the flame at the end of the barrel, can remain lit so long as you continue to have it on. So the point is, what we're saying is the eternal fire isn't necessarily the flames, the specific flames in which the wicked will burn, but rather the source of those flames, the eternal fire, the quintessential consuming fire himself, God, who himself is described, like I said, as a consuming fire and as everlasting. But that doesn't require that the flames in which the wicked burn up remain perpetual any more than that flamethrower example I gave. The foliage can burn up and the fire dissipate, even though the fire at the end of the barrel is still burning. So I just wanted to give people that picture to remind them of how a fire can outlast the source flame of a fire can outlast the fires in which something else burns. Anyway, I don't know if I explained that very well, but
another example of that is the perpetual flame that burns on the temple and tabernacle altars. That burnt. It's obviously not there anymore. It's a perpetual flame, and all fires that are used in the temple at all have to be kindled from that, or you fall under the curse of strange fire. I like to think of this as something that's important enough that this perpetual flame would have an analogy to in the temple that's not made with hands, the divine temple mentioned in Hebrews 9. And that might very well be the eternal fire. A fire that not only must not go out, but that will not go out. And of course, its purpose is not to burn people up. Its purpose is not to torment people. Its purpose is to serve in the temple. It doesn't, it's not going out doesn't mean people are still being burnt up. And
that reminds me of, I think it's in Isaiah, maybe Jeremiah or Ezekiel, but where the prophet asks, who can dwell in the everlasting flames, and it seemed one possible reading of that text is that only the righteous will be able to, and the idea there to continue what you're talking about with this eternal flame in the heavenly temple, it could very well be that depending upon whether you're covered by the blood of Christ, that fire is, that unmitigated presence of God is experienced as bliss and as joy and as life-giving and etc. But if you're not covered by the blood of Christ, that very same unmitigated presence of God will consume you. That seems to be a plausible read as well. It also happens to line up very nicely with Eastern Orthodox conceptions of the eschaton, although probably most Eastern Orthodox think that the lost will be tormented forever by that flame, by that unmitigated presence of God. But nevertheless, the point is they see the same fire as being life-giving and blissful to the righteous, but tormenting to the wicked. And we can say the same thing, except instead of tormenting, it's destructive. Right. All right. Well, anyway, let's continue if that's good with you.
Yeah.
Again, the punishment of Gehenna is contrasted and not equated with killing. And here, what is more than what we find in Matthew, we find that one is cast into Gehenna after being killed.
All right, so here Farrar is trading on the parallel to Matthew 10:28 in Luke 12, wherein Luke records Jesus saying, "Don't fear men who can kill you, but after that can do no more to you. Rather fear God who after the killing can throw you into Gehenna." Right? That's a paraphrase. And so he's saying that with that in mind, it and Matthew 10:28 don't liken or equate punishment and killing, but rather contrast them. Men can kill, God can punish, not kill. So what are your thoughts on, and I think we're going to say more about some of these claims that he's making about Luke and Matthew, but what are your thoughts on this clip that we just played?
Yes. So Jesus just said men can kill, and he went on to say that God can also kill and then throw into Gehenna. Killing is therefore, it's not a contrast. It's not something God is trying to say happens differently between God and men. It's a parallel. Killing equals killing. What happens after is different. And I'm sure he would have to agree with this. And one other thing. You can't see it in some translations. It says after the killing or something like that, but that's actually a verb. It's actually a verb with a subject of he. After he kills, present tense.
Hold on a second. Let's make sure that we're right about that before proceeding, because when I'm looking at the Greek, I've got so what the ESV translates fear him who after he has killed has authority to cast into hell. The Greek is phobethete, so that's fear. Ton meta ta apaktenai echanta. So that's neither. Those aren't actually verbs. Not exactly. Ta apaktenai, that's an infinitive, and then echanta is a participle. No, well, apaktenai is an infinitive, but echanta is a participle. It looks like it should be okay. That's okay. So I'm not sure it's true I'm not sure it's accurate to say that this is that kill here in the second clause is a verb with a subject. It looks like a literal translation would be fear the one having authority to fear the one who after the killing has authority to throw into Gehenna. So there actually isn't it's not explicit in the Greek that God is doing the killing here. It just says after the killing. I think I don't.
Thanks for checking. I actually I agree that's an infinitive. I checked this before, and somehow I got that as a indicative, which is weird. That's definitely not. Thanks. Yeah. All right.
I don't think that necessarily changes much of the analysis, but
it shouldn't. It shouldn't, because there's still and here I'm going to again refer to translations, but in a different tone. There's a lot of support in the translations for seeing that killing is attached to the same one who's punishing.
Yes.
Whether that would have been absolutely convincing if I'd been right in my previous
it would have been.
And this is why you should never depend on an interlinear, but checking an interlinear isn't a bad idea.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. With that said, so this is I believe there's good support for saying that this is God's act of killing and not something unassociated with the punishment. He is not, for example, saying that God will take somebody who was killed as a martyr and cast them into Gehenna. It's someone whose killing was not done by men.
Well, in fact,
it is someone that God kills.
You've just made a really critical point, and I want to highlight this for viewers, because this isn't even, I didn't even realize this until you just said it in a different way that I'm about to. So the reason the reason the literal translation would be after the killing is because we've got the infinitive, which is often a gerund, I don't know how to pronounce that, like killing. But it's got an article, the definite article. And when the definite article is there, it makes it a specific instance of killing, not just killing in general. And if it's not talking about God doing the killing, then there's only one other candidate in the context, and that is those who kill the body and after that have nothing more they can do. Mm-hmm. So this is the point I'm getting at. Remember, Jesus is encouraging his disciples to stay faithful in the face of death. The ones he is talking about killing the body and then have nothing more they can do are unrighteous persecutors of the saints. Mm-hmm. But of course, the ones they kill, the saints, God isn't going to cast into hell. Yeah. So clearly, the killing there in verse 5 can't refer back to the killing just mentioned, because that is specifically the first killing is a killing of the righteous. Here in verse 5, it's a killing of the wicked, who will then be cast into hell. So there is no option. It's not the Greek that makes this clear. It's the contrast between 4 and 5 and the nature of the definite article and apokteinai here. There's just no way for that killing to be the same killing in verse 4. And so the only option is that God is the one who's doing the killing and then casting into Gehenna.
Yeah, all right.
So you got it right. We just got there a different way than you originally thought. That's all.
So what happens after this, the killing, is not Luke teaching that God can cause pain to dead people. Although Farrar claims that this is people who are post-killing, that would actually contradict his own church's catechism. We discussed that catechism in our first episode, and it says that everyone is given incorruptible life as part of the universal resurrection. Rather, I would propose that this is actually Luke's way of alluding to the passage we just looked at, Isaiah 66. But this time adding verse 16, the whole scope of verse 16 through 24, which says that God will slay the wicked, and then he will throw their corpses in that cursed valley, exposed as objects of abhorrence. So I think this passage joins Mark as talking about, as actually alluding to Isaiah 66 in a slightly different way by describing, not by quoting it, but by describing the major events that happen in it, that God will slay the wicked and then throw them.
Yeah, and one way to understand to understand this as well, one way to approach it that is compatible with what you've just suggested, but I think could also be true even if what we've just suggested isn't right. Mm-hmm. And this other approach is to understand that Jesus is saying one thing, but we've got two biographers recording what he said differently. So here's the way I try to explain it. I'm a believer in inerrancy. I don't think any of the Bible is in error in any way. That's neither here nor there. But what I don't believe as an inerrantist is that every single word attributed to Jesus, say, by the biographers, is actually, in fact, the very words that Jesus used. In biblical scholarship, one way to characterize what the biographers are doing is to capture the gist of what Jesus is saying. And so you might imagine somebody saying something from stage, and then two reporters in the audience, they may not they may use indirect quoting, right? They're not quoting the speaker in quotation marks, but rather they're saying the speaker said that blah blah blah. And those two different reporters may have slightly different ways of paraphrasing what the original speaker said, but it doesn't mean that they're not that either one is inaccurate. And in a similar way, I think what's going on here is that both Matthew and Luke are recording the gist of what Jesus said, but Jesus said only one thing. And what that means is that both what Matthew and Luke say must both must be equally true of an equally true record of what Jesus says, albeit in perhaps other words. And so what that means then is that you can't oh, you know what? I think I'm going off on another rabbit trail. So let me explain to viewers what I mean. The rabbit trail I'm going down is meant to rebut the claim that Jesus says only that God can destroy in Gehenna, but not that he will. And the reason I bring out this gist stuff when I go down that road is because the way Luke records the gist of what Jesus says is to say God can cast into Gehenna, but we have several places in the New Testament that explicitly say God will cast into Gehenna. And so since Luke and Matthew are both recording the gist of what Jesus says, and because Luke says can cast into Gehenna, which is something the New Testament says God will do, that means that what Matthew records Jesus saying God can do, God will do. That's what I was going down. I apologize. That was a completely off-topic rabbit trail. But here is another possible way to understand the relationship between Matthew's and Luke's record of Jesus's gist, and that is to say that imagine if you've got one person saying that Jesus said God will destroy them, body and soul, in Gehenna, and the other person saying that Jesus said will kill and then throw into Gehenna. One possible reconciliation of both of those things is to say both are conceiving of this Isaianic and Jeremianic, I don't know if that's the right word, scene in which God's enemies are slain in Gehenna or slain and then cast into Gehenna. And one of them is treating those things as concurrent in Gehenna, and the other one is treating them as one immediately after the other. Imagine, so here's a way to imagine it. Imagine you've got somebody standing at the precipice of a cliff, and another person cuts their throat and then kicks them off the cliff, right? I know I'm getting a little gruesome, but the point here is the sort of act of killing is initiated or performed at the precipice of the cliff, and then they're kicked off the cliff into the valley, right? One person might record that in a very precise and temporal way and say he killed him and then kicked him into the ravine, right? But another person might say he killed him in the ravine. Mm-hmm. Now, the other person I would not say is being inaccurate. They're just sort of they're summarizing, right? They're capturing everything that happens in a more singular statement, whereas the other one is breaking it down into parts. And I think a similar thing could be going on with Luke and Matthew. It could very well be that the truth is that they will be killed at the precipice of the valley and then tossed into the valley. But from outside the valley, looking in on that scene, it's all one geographical area, right? So another person might just say they're killed in Gehenna, and maybe that's what Matthew's doing, whereas Luke is doing the former. So I think there's multiple ways to understand this in a way that doesn't pit Luke against Mark or Matthew, or try to say that the annihilationist implications of Matthew are mistaken on the basis of Luke. I don't think any of those kinds of things are substantiated. I think we've offered a number of different ways in which that needn't be true. Anyway, sorry, I've been rambling here. Anything more you want to say?
Sure. I guess I made a note that I wanted to bring up a point that if you do a word search on Gehenna, it's an interesting thing that in the New Testament, you won't find any passage that suggests any sign of life. That word is just, the verse associated with it contains only signs of death. Even the phrase weeping and gnashing that is so familiar in the hell debate, it doesn't appear in the verses about Gehenna. Doesn't settle any argument, but it is interesting.
Well, it's of course just because life and existence aren't the same thing, right? That's what they're going to say. But anyway, all right, we good to proceed?
Yep.
So the question that we could ask here is whether this punishment refers merely to discarding and burning of corpses, because if killing essentially is the eschatological punishment, if being killed and ceasing to exist is the eschatological punishment, then what is the point of contrast that Luke is making here that causes us to fear God and not fear the one that can only kill and do nothing more? It's difficult to say what it could be, unless it is that your corpse is then thrown into Gehenna, which is just a big furnace that will just consume it into ashes, and that will be it. There's nothing left.
All right. So I know I have some thoughts on this. I want to ask you yours first. And just to be clear for the audience, in this clip, what Farrar is claiming is that the annihilationist reading of Luke this is his claim, the annihilationist reading of Luke here seems to require that the punishment that follows being killed is nothing more than the punishment of the discarding of your corpse, of one's corpse. And that strikes him as, not very likely. He doesn't explicitly state that here, but what do you make of that? Is it the case that an annihilationist reading of this must see there being a killing and then some subsequent punishment, the divine punishment that is nothing more than the casting aside of corpses?
I'm actually going to come back to this in just a moment, but I want to give you a foretaste to think about while we're discussing the next couple of quotes from Farrar, and that is that to punish does not just mean to cause to experience pain. Verses like Daniel 12:2 famously that says they will wake to shame. Shame is part of a punishment, and it is a pretty crucial part. It's a part that really ultimately only God can enforce. So we at conditionalists, we also state that to be killed, to be permanently deprived of life, in the dictionary it says to permanently cause body functions to cease, to permanently cause all vital functions to cease. That is a punishment, deprivation of life. But there is a additional punishment of shame, and I think that's very intensely the point in Isaiah 66, and that's the point, therefore, specifically in Mark 9 when it refers to that being discarded into Gehenna.
Let me interject for a moment, if you don't mind, because I think that when you're saying shame and what you just said, what you mean is what translations of Isaiah and Daniel refer to as contempt.
Yes.
So,
yes.
so the reason I point that out.
No, actually, I did mean shame. They wake to shame, and part of that, the essential horror of that shame, is that they will be forever held in contempt.
Right. But what I'm trying to get at is that Isaiah, so Daniel mentions both the shame and then the subsequent everlasting contempt.
Right.
But Isaiah mentions neither. Isaiah only mentions the contempt, right? The corpses will be exactly. So I just wanted to be careful and precise that to the extent Mark is trading on Isaiah, it wouldn't be the shame, the subjectively felt shame on the part of the wicked that is in view, but rather the contempt in which those slain rebels are thereafter held.
That's correct.
Okay.
And I apologize, because what I was doing was I was kind of sweeping a spotlight over the varieties of punishment.
True, right.
Subjective component with an objective driver. You know that the entire community around you is pointing at you and that they are right. They've been proven right. The abhorrence drives that shame. The abhorrence that the community will always feel for what you did drives the shame.
At least in part, right? It seems equally possible that some component of that shame would be a divinely imposed realization, of one's own sinfulness, right? I mean,
right. And that would we would call that guilt. You know, a
like a guilty conscience.
Divine imposition of guilt, which is the subjective knowledge that you were wrong, versus a divine imposition of shame, which is the subjective knowledge that everyone else knows you're wrong.
Right. Right. So then, so that might lead us to nicely into the next clip then, because, well, here, let's just play that and then add a few more thoughts before we continue after that.
But then, if it refers to discarding and burning of corpses, if that's the punishment of Gehenna, then how really does that differ from what men can do? Because human beings can also burn a corpse to ashes after killing someone.
Right. So all I wanted to say here was, so in the previous clip, we cited Daniel and Isaiah and other passages that indicate that the punishment is not merely the privation of life, although that is, I would argue, the focus, the main portion of the punishment, the main punishment, but it's also got these elements of subjectively felt guilt, subjectively felt shame, and then the contempt in which the wicked will then be held forever after being slain. And so right off the bat, we see there's nothing out of place if what Luke is saying is that God will both kill and subsequently throw corpses into Gehenna as a shameful, contemptible memorial or whatever. So we've already established that. But then here, what Farrar is saying is that, well, men can do that too, right? They can cast somebody into a valley unceremoniously, right? Shamefully, contemptibly. And so how is that different how is that different from what God can do? Well, here's the thing, though, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this as well, William, but it seems to me that, yes, men can kill somebody and then leave their corpse exposed in a shameful way, but they can't render that permanent. God is going to raise from the dead everybody that men kill in that fashion. Their shame, their contempt, the contempt in which they're held, none of that will be everlasting, because God's going to raise the dead. But when God does it, when He casts people into Gehenna as as fulfillment of this eschatological scene of inglorious destruction of God's rebels, God's enemies. When God does that, it will never be reversed, and their contempt will indeed be everlasting. So it seems to me that, especially if Gehenna here, notice that what Luke says isn't merely that God can cast into some valley, right?
Yeah.
He says God can cast specifically into Gehenna. And that suggests to me that the point is not merely that He's discarding of the corpse, but that it's evoking this eschatological scene in Isaiah and in Jeremiah and elsewhere about a final, everlasting, irreversible punishment. And that seems to be what Luke and Matthew are saying God can do, but people can't, is not just end people temporarily, after which at some point, and ingloriously, after which at some point in the future, God's going to resurrect them, possibly unto glory, if they're saints that have been killed in that way, but that God can render people ingloriously dead and contemptible forever.
Right.
But those are my thoughts in pushing back on this thing that Farrar is saying. Do you have any thoughts on it?
I hope I can say this briefly, because I actually want to cover a related topic in the very next quote.
Okay.
But hopefully this will serve. This is one of the verses that I think shows Gehenna cannot refer to the valley. Because quite arguably, there's nothing more to say if this is just men cannot throw into the valley outside of Jerusalem,
right,
which they did in AD 70. What even is Christ trying to say there? I've heard people propose that, yeah, he makes that verdict stick, that it's permanent, but nobody knows about it. I mean, there's a whole community of not exactly Pharisees, but rabbis that emerged from the Pharisees and looked back and went, those were pretty cool people. I mean,
Yeah.
I like the Targums. I'm not unhappy with what they wrote. It's yeah. Anyway, let's go on to the next quote.
But
Yeah.
I want to just really quick flesh that out just a little bit more. What you're saying is that, and I agree with this. I've been saying for some time that Gehenna, that Greek toponym, isn't exactly a reference to the Valley of the Son of Hinnom, but rather it is a reference to final punishment that evokes these eschatological scenes that were portrayed as taking place in the Valley of the Son of Hinnom. So the analogy I'll sometimes give is I might see a nuclear power plant breaking down, and I might say, we're about to have a modern day Chernobyl, right? And by saying Chernobyl, I'm not necessarily referring to the decades-old event in Chernobyl, but rather I'm saying we're about to have an event that is like what happened in Chernobyl. And in a similar, not perfectly identical, but in a similar way, I tend to think that when Jesus and the New Testament authors talk about Gehenna, that's what they're doing. They're talking about a final punishment that is like what was described as taking place in the Valley of Hinnom in the Old Testament. It's a way of evoking that scene, not necessarily referring to the specific valley as the place where it will take place. Is that something kind of like what you're getting to?
Yes, I think that's correct. And Isaiah, well, I should say the Targums in general never use the word Gehenna where you can, in a place where there's a place name. The only place where that might be an exception is one passage that in the Hebrew says Topheth. But in most other ancient texts, it uses a different word, a slight change of the word that I can't remember anymore. But it's thought that the Targum coming at the time it did might not have had access. It might have used the Septuagint or something like that.
Yeah.
And so had a different word in there and didn't have a place name.
And I seem to recall, when I looked into this last time, that in the Septuagint, the Valley of the Son of Hinnom isn't called Gehenna either. It's called something close, right? So,
yeah, it's Gay Hinnom or Gay bin Hinnom.
Right, or something close to that. There's a few different ways, and some come very close to Gehenna, which we see in the New Testament. Right. But none of them that I recall becomes identical. And so I think you're right that's also an indication that Gehenna isn't the valley itself, but rather a reference to eschatological punishment, evoking the scenes that take place in the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom. All right, but you said but you said you wanted to say more on the next clip, so let's continue.
Let's do it.
So there must be something that God can do after killing, that namely throwing into Gehenna, that is qualitatively different than what human beings could do by doing something to a corpse after they've killed the person.
All right, William?
So Chris has already pointed out that what men might do to corpses, or rather, I'll add to Chris's statement, what men might do to corpses is no longer a punishment to the saints. It's not really a punishment to anyone that's, you're dead. It just doesn't matter. But specifically the saints, any dishonor that's done to them, any desecration, doesn't actually apply to the person, because God, by the time they're back there to look at it, they're going to be glorified. It will be absolutely certain. And what I want to say, the word I want to use is that men lack the authority to make any desecration actually apply to the person. Yes. I want to use the word authority because that's the actual word Luke uses here. God has the authority to throw into Gehenna. That's sometimes translated can, it's sometimes translated power, but it's not the same word that Matthew 10:28 uses, where it is God has the power, the ability.
Oh, that's interesting. So you're saying that in Matthew it's has the power or the ability, but in Luke it's has the authority.
Yes, exactly.
Let me just confirm that really quick for the audience. Not because I don't believe you, but because I want to give them the yeah. So in Matthew 10:28, it's me dunamenon, right? That's that second verb there, that or participle. That's from the verb dunamai, which means is able, right, or can. But in Luke, as I just got done saying a minute ago, it's not dunamis or dunamai, but rather echonta, having, and then exousion, right? So authority. So whereas Matthew says God has the dunamis, or is dunamai, able to do this, Luke says God echonta has exousion, authority to do so.
Yes.
All right, sorry, continue.
Yeah, definitely. You see, I'm playing 5-dimensional chess here. I'm tempting you to think I'm unreliable, and then I'm going to zoom
That's exactly
around.
right. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so, and what I would say that authority emphasizes is that when he throws them in, that is the right thing to do. There's nobody who's ever going to undermine or override that in either sense. And that judgment leads to the future we've discussed briefly before, where the wise, shining like stars and teaching many, as Daniel 12:3 says, will recall the abhorrent foolishness of wickedness. And of course, the wicked are not there to give their opinion on how wise they were. So God's authority is what renders being thrown into Gehenna eternally significant. So taking those 2 points, putting them together, conditionalists can directly affirm what the verse says without knowing about any of the other verses it might be referring to. The fact that God is doing this means it's done with authority that cannot be overturned. In context, that men might be doing other things that might be condemning loyal disciples, throwing them into Gehenna, trying to shame them, those will all be overturned.
Excellent.
And that's it.
All right, we're going to turn now to some clips, a few clips that we've categorized under the rubric of the language of better and worse fates. So let's start looking at these. Some of these verses we're going to be talking about do come up a lot in the debate, and so it'll be good to hear what Farrar says and then respond. So let's see what we can say here.
There's only one passage in Mark that mentions Gehenna, but it mentions it thrice, and that's Mark 9:42-48. And here, Mark is implicitly describing Gehenna as a fate worse than a gruesome execution, because he has Jesus saying that it would be better to be thrown into the sea with a millstone about the neck than implicitly to suffer the fate of Gehenna.
All right, William.
Yeah, I'm grateful that he used the word imply here rather than claiming that Mark actually said that. Often in these debates, it's tempting to say Jesus said, and then you say something that you kind of would have liked him to say.
That's bitten me. That's bitten me a few times, and so I think I've gotten into the habit of saying indicates, because that's a little looser, right? That could be explicit or imply. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
It's embarrassing when I do that. Thankfully, he didn't do that. He wins. But what Mark said here might not actually imply worse than execution. So, question. Does Mark intend to imply final punishment for making a little one stumble? That's the crime that Christ describes, is worse than being executed at all in any way? Or does he intend to say it's worse than being executed in the very specific way he describes, giving many details? So if Mark is saying that eternal punishment is worse than being executed, and eternal torment is what everyone gets apart from submission to Christ, wouldn't Christ's specification of the specific sin here be completely beside the point? Because as for our beliefs, that's everyone's punishment by our nature. That's what we all deserve.
Even somebody who doesn't lead children astray,
Yes.
but isn't under the blood of Christ, they too will receive a punishment in final punishment worse than being drowned like this, which means there, like you said, there's no point in mentioning this particular sin if that's what's going on.
Just so, exactly. And finally, just a little call for context. We have Mark 9. This is the chapter Mark 9. But in the verse just before Mark 9, Christ also didn't mention Gehenna. This verse doesn't mention Gehenna, and Christ also didn't mention Gehenna in Mark 8. But he does mention final punishment. He just mentions it without naming Gehenna. What he says there is that the Son will testify against us, that the Son, it actually says the Son will be ashamed of you before the Father and the holy angels. That is a final judgment scene, or at least it's a judgment scene. And the punishment that's in scope there, and the reference here is Mark 8, 34 through 38. The punishment that is in scope there is described as losing your life.
Well, let me play devil's advocate there for a moment, though, William, because the word translated life there is psuche, which sometimes is translated soul, not life. And in fact, the ESV renders that word life in verse 35, but soul in verse 36. So what would you say if Farrar were to push back on this reference to Mark 8 by saying, no. Jesus isn't saying that the punishment is loss of life, but rather the punishment of loss of soul, I guess.
Yeah. And I'd first point out that this is in more modern translations, which should match current English development, is routinely rendered loss of life. It's just rendered that way. But it's also amplified because even the old translations cannot render psuche as soul in every point of that passage. They actually do render it life at several points. But in addition, and here I cannot remember the cross-reference I'm thinking of, but this passage is probably the most concentrated use of loss of life. It discusses loss of life in many different ways. And Christ, excuse me, not Christ, but the other gospel writers quote little parts of this passage everywhere else, or Christ repeated little parts of this saying everywhere else, one or the other, however you want to put that. But in Luke specifically, Luke explained it, or Christ explained it, and Luke quoted him saying that this would mean to lose yourself. So the essential idea of losing your soul is what carries on you. You know, your soul going on means you go on. If you lose your soul, well, how do you get separated from your soul? How do you, is it, I mean, I have a sofa here that devours things. So maybe
it's hard enough to make sense of how the punishment could be God losing a soul, right? Which is what some traditionalists seem to try to argue when they argue that apolemy, meaning destroy, can mean lose.
Right. And that would be Matthew 10:28, the power to oops,
where'd you go? Right. So that's hard enough, but it's even more absurd to think that the person is losing himself. I mean, I don't even know what that, or his own soul. I don't even know what that would possibly mean.
Well, and the obvious way that would all fit together is that if it were an intensified version of losing your life, you're not there anymore.
Yeah.
Nobody can find you, least of all you.
And just to give viewers one of those cross references you mentioned in the other Gospels, where what Jesus says in Mark 9 is sort of quoted in pieces. One example of that is Matthew 10:39. Whoever finds his life, or psuche, whoever finds his psuche will lose it, and whoever loses his psuche for my sake will find it. Now, this is really critical for two reasons. For one thing, psuche can't possibly mean soul here, okay? And this is why. What possible sense does it make to speak of somebody finding his non-physical spirit or soul? That doesn't even make sense.
Yeah.
But secondly, wait, where was I going with this? So it's, yeah. And secondly,
to find your soul doesn't make sense, but to find, or at least to seek your life.
Yes, right, exactly. And then here's the second point that I wanted to make on this. Some people will argue that although psuche is used here, they might try to argue that the concept of life here is the kind of life they think is communicated by the word zoe, right? They think it's some kind of special quality of life or something like that. But consider how, so they would say that life is life in the fullest sense, right? In a divine sense, in full fellowship with God, they might try to argue. But here's why that can't possibly be what that means here. Because then it would be saying that whoever finds his fullness of life in God will lose it. That makes no sense, right? So there's only one possible meaning of psuche in Matthew 10:39, at least, and I think this is the case in the other parallels as well, and that is embodied life, physical life. Whoever, tries to cling to his life to hold on to it will ultimately lose it, but whoever is willing to lose his life for my sake will find it. And that's conditional immortality in a single verse, Anyway, go on.
Yeah, actually, I'm just going to finish by looping back and closing the point I was making, and then we can go on playing. So this verse that we're looking at now, Mark 8:34 through 38, is the lead-in to Mark 9. There were no chapter markers in Mark's gospel, at least not that we know of. So this is actually material to what Christ goes into talking about. This is actually, I believe, if I haven't missed anything, I think this is Mark's first direct mention of a divine final punishment, assuming that this judgment where the Son testifies before the Father is the final punishment. So he's trying to say that this slightly later passage is the first mention of Gehenna, even though it doesn't mention Gehenna. Why shouldn't this be the first mention of it instead? And so we set the context by talking about loss of life, and then we go into a passage that says it's worse than a kind of execution. That seems very salient. It's something that draws attention once you start thinking about it.
Yeah. And we're going to talk a little bit more after the next clip about the concept of one execution being worse than another. But one thing I want to throw out there is that may not be the point at all. So there's an assumption here in the text. There's something implied or assumed that that traditionalists seem to miss when they press this verse into service in the way that Farrar is doing. And that is, they assume that that the alternative to being what am I trying to get at here? They're assuming, so let me not try to characterize what they're assuming, and let me just try to make the point I'm getting at, and you've made it in our notes, but it was one that I wanted to make as well, and that is the assumption is that that there are two options. You can either be drowned in the sea, having had a millstone tied around your neck, but having not earned yourself a place in hell, or you can do what earns yourself a place in hell and not be drowned in, having a millstone tied around your neck and drowned. In other words, yes, being executed in hell would indeed be worse than being executed on earth, being executed in the here and now, but then going on to eternal life. Right? That's the key here, is that presumably the one who avoids meriting this final punishment, the one who avoids, the one who has the millstone tied around his neck and is drowned, that person, in the context of this warning, does not do the thing that merits the worst punishment. Right? So the contrast is between avoiding a particular sin and being killed at the hands of men, but then raised unto eternal life later, versus doing the thing now and avoid, and not having a millstone tied around your neck and drowned, but meriting for yourself a punishment that's worse than that. Right? So the point I'm getting at is that, and I'm not doing a great job of articulating it, and so if you can think of a way to do it better than I've been doing here in a moment, I'd welcome you to do so. But the point I'm trying to make is that what this final punishment may be worse than is not merely being executed, but being executed at the hands of men, but then raised to eternal life. And of course, being finally and forever executed would be worse than that. And I think that's a possibility that Farrar and other traditionalists miss. But I don't know how well I articulated that. So if you want to add on anything, you can. Otherwise, we can go on to the next clip.
I think we'll be able to discuss that more in a moment.
All right. Well, then let's continue.
Having a millstone fastened around your neck and being thrown into the sea is a pretty terrible form of execution. And it is just that. It's a form of execution. It will cause your death if it happens to you. So the fact that Jesus is contrasting implicitly the eschatological punishment with this punishment implies to me that it is something more than execution, because the alternative would be to argue, no, it's just another form of execution that is worse than having a great millstone fastened around your neck and be thrown into the depths of the sea. But, that seems to me to be sort of gratuitously gory, for lack of a better term. If Jesus is just saying, let me arbitrarily choose a gruesome form of execution, the kind of execution that is awaiting those that cause a little one to sin is another form of execution that's worse than that.
All right, so there's a couple of things that Farrar is here saying, and that is, I guess the main thing he's trying to say is that Jesus, he's saying that if the contrast that Jesus is making is between one gruesome execution and an even more gruesome execution, he's saying that if that's what's going on, he struggles to see how that makes much sense, number one. But number two, he uses some words that strike me as wholly inappropriate here. I mean, the word arbitrary, for example. He says Jesus arbitrarily picks, right? I guess maybe that could be appropriate. So maybe ignore that part. But the point is, he's saying that he's saying there's some inconsistency, that there's something wrong with understanding Jesus to be merely contrasting one gruesome kind of execution with a future form of execution that's even more gruesome than that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that a serious problem with his whole explanation here is in that word arbitrary. He cannot explain why Jesus is being specific here. Jesus was specific. Was it because he was being arbitrary? Did he just randomly invent all of those details for no reason at all? Why didn't he say, if he just wanted to say it's worse than being executed, why didn't he just say that? It'd be much better to just be executed.
That's a good point. Yeah. So what you're saying is, the argument that that Farrar is trying to make here is that the punishment he's warning about must be worse than execution, period. So
Right.
which would mean it can't be execution. But if that were the case, then actually Farrar is the one who is making Jesus guilty of arbitrarily choosing some form of execution.
Right.
That's a good point. Go on.
Right. And so what I would propose when somebody gives a lot of detail, what's kind of likely, what at least must be considered, is that the detail matters, that they wouldn't have added the detail if they didn't want you to use that detail to build your own picture. So I don't know what the base, what the unmodified, if you stripped away the detail, would Jesus say, it's, being executed is bad. Being executed by being thrown into the sea with a millstone around your neck is worse. It's going to be worse than that in the same way. I don't think it's that simple. We can actually debate what the base form that Jesus was picturing, but one thing that occurs to me is that the base would be being thrown into the sea. You picture someone being thrown into the sea, then you picture someone being thrown into the sea with a millstone around their neck. The difference in that particular case, if I'm right about that, would be the certainty of the punishment. You're not getting out of that. It's not pain. Again, if I were correct about that, you actually would have less pain due to the millstone than if you were able to keep yourself above water for a little bit before you ran out of energy. Does that make sense? Using the details given in the picture to establish a direction where Jesus is trying to get us to look.
Yeah, I do think it makes sense, because the prospect of death by drowning, although fearsome, doesn't strike me as particularly gruesome, or even painful for that matter. My understanding, I could be wrong about this.
Oh, obviously, you watched The Prestige.
Well, it might have been Prestige, but I'm actually thinking
it starts with somebody saying, "Oh no, it's not painful; it's kind of blissful." He's lying.
Well, no, that's actually not what I had in mind. I think I was combining. I read Dan Brown's stupid books, the Da Vinci Code and then Angels and Demons or whatever, and I watched both movies, and I remember a killer trying to kill the lead character in a fountain, and I'm tying what I read there with some stuff I learned elsewhere. But anyway, my understanding is that when a conscious person drowns to death, what happens is they're holding their breath as long as they are capable of doing so, and the lack of oxygen then causes them to lose consciousness. And once they lose consciousness, their automatic breathing process kicks in and they breathe in a bunch of water. And then that's when they violently jerk and die, but they're unconscious while it's happening. And if that's true, it's a big if. I've never been drowned, so I don't know. But if that's true, then actually dying by drowning isn't all that particular. I mean, it's terrible, but there are way worse ways to die. I'd rather die by drowning than many other forms of death. On the other hand, and this is the point you were getting at, I think, what is the purpose of mentioning not just drowning, but drowning by having a great millstone tied around your neck? And this is really important, because the fact that he calls it a great millstone and not just a millstone means that he's referring to one of the larger animal-powered millstones that first century people used in Judea. These were 4 to 5 feet in diameter. They were enormous and extremely heavy. And it seems clear that the point Jesus is making with that is exactly what you said. If you're just tossed into the sea, say with your hands bound, your hands and feet bound, possibly you might survive that. Maybe you could figure out a way to float. Maybe you could somehow wiggle your hands free, whatever. But in the same way that the mob, might make somebody stand in a block of concrete and then have it dry and then toss them into the river, right? That concrete's going to pull them down. There's no getting out of that. And in the same way, the mention of the millstone being tied around the neck seems to be meant to communicate that you're not going to be able to escape it. It's certain. And that's the point you're making, is that the sense in which the greater future divine punishment is greater than this earthly one that's being described here is in the greater degree of inescapability. Because if you as a saint are persecuted unto death, say by having a millstone tied around your neck and tossed into the sea, that death is inescapable, but it's reversible. The same isn't true of final divine punishment. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
That, and also don't assume that added details are arbitrary.
Right.
Rather assume that those details wouldn't be added if they weren't important.
Right. So then we've got at least a couple of different ways of rebutting a traditionalist use of this text in arguing against annihilationism. On the one hand, so one possibility is that the contrast is between a death that humans can inflict, which is inescapable but reversible, versus a death that God will inflict, which is inescapable and forever. Another possible understanding of the verse consistent with conditionalism is to say that, to be finally killed by God in hell is worse than being killed and not going to hell, right? So there's at least a couple of different ways of understanding that. But maybe now we can turn to one more clip in this category of better and worse fates, having to do with Judas Iscariot. You ready to talk about that one?
I sure am.
Jesus, commenting on his betrayer, says in Mark 14:21, paralleled in Matthew, "It would have been better for that one not to have been born." So one could argue that Jesus is here favorably comparing non-existence with the eschatological punishment, because if you were never born, if you never existed, then that is non-existence. But if it would have been better for that one not to have been born, then that implies that what is going to happen to that one is in fact worse than non-existence.
So this is I've heard this argument before, and here's how I respond to it. So first of all, it's worth noting, as our friend Ronnie Demler has pointed out, that Jesus doesn't actually say it would be better for Judas never to have existed. He says it would have been better for Jesus never to have been born. That wouldn't rule out, according to Ronnie, the possibility of being conceived but being, say, miscarried, in which case you're not born, and by virtue of having not been born, or by virtue of not having been born, Judas never has the opportunity to do the things that ultimately end him up in final punishment. And I think that's a legitimate point, but I don't find that to be extremely compelling. And so I look at it a different way. I think that being annihilated by God in hell is indeed worse than to have never existed, but not because the final punishment doesn't include ceasing to exist consciously. Rather, it's at least very feasible that the reason it would be worse, the reason it's worse for Judas to have existed and then not exist anymore, having been slain in hell, is because precisely because of those elements of shame and contempt that we talked about earlier. See, and not to mention, for that matter, the pain involved and the shame subjectively experienced as part of being destroyed in hell. So think about what would have happened had Judas never existed. Well, he would have never existed. He would have never experienced life, etc. But he also would not be forever remembered as the slime ball who betrayed the God incarnate into the hands of his killers, right? But he did exist. And because he existed and lived, he went on to walk and talk with God incarnate, do ministry with God incarnate, see God incarnate perform all these miracles, etc., and yet still betray God incarnate into the hands of his killers. Be so ashamed by that he tried to give the money back and thereby prevent Jesus from being killed, but failed to do so, and so then in shame hang himself to death, and then have his corpse hanging from that tree ingloriously fall to the ground and burst open and have his innards ingloriously spill out onto the ground. And then, if dualism is true, experience 2,000 plus years of torment in a hellish intermediate state. And then be resurrected and exposed before all humankind as the vile, disgusting sinner who betrayed God incarnate into the hands of his persecutors, and then be slain violently and painfully, and then forever remembered in abject contempt. That all of that is far worse for somebody who cares about how he's remembered after he's gone, not to mention all the other things that I mentioned, than to have never existed at all. So I don't see anything compelling in this traditionalist argument, because in order for that argument to be made, you have to ignore all those other things leading up to ceasing to exist and following, and focus only on the fact of not existing any longer. And that seems to me wholly illegitimate. But what about you? How do you respond to this argument from Farrar?
Right. So one of the a hypothesis I have about final punishment is that one of its purposes is to say that sin does not pay. Nobody profits from having committed sin. Now, life, it's a fundamental Christian, and as far as I can find, Jewish tenet that being created is good. Coming into existence is a gift of God. The conditions of life are sometimes miserable, but the net effect, we claim, is good for you. It is subjective good and objective good. So God gave Judas this gift of life, and then God in the flesh predicted that it would be better for him to not have gotten that gift in the end. And the thought that runs through my mind is, well, his punishment must be absolutely terrible for that to be said, because I believe that God is good to everyone. So Jesus in the sermon, yes, it is the Sermon on the Mount. He says, so that would be Matthew 5 towards the end of it. He says that we're to imitate God in his love towards all whose sins reign on the just and on the unjust. So he has compassion and love on his enemies. There's several other verses like that. I believe Acts 17, the sermon, Paul's sermon on the Mars Hill, the Areopagus, where he emphasizes God's kindness towards all. But if the normal expectation, if this verse is defining eternal torment, then it would seem to follow that everyone is better off had they not lived. So is God kind towards all? Is God loving towards all? Or is God just restraining himself until he's going to make everybody wish they hadn't been born, literally, in those words? That's problematic, right? That's chilling. And I don't see a way around it. If this verse is defining eternal torment as a universal doctrine, then it has a serious outcome for monotheism. We have a God that is good and is good to everything he has created. So anyway, that's one point at where I don't think that comes to a conclusion we want to apply. Okay, so maybe Judas is eternally tormented and everyone else is not, because otherwise, what does that imply? With that said, that's philosophical. You can't test that against Scripture.
Well, I think that's an interesting rebuttal to his reading of it. But how do you take the verse then? What do you think Jesus means by saying it would be good or better had he never been born?
Yeah, I wasn't thinking I was going to say this is strictly my opinion, but I'll go ahead and own this one. I think this is comparable to some other texts in the Bible that are talking about suicide. Although Job never directly, explicitly in so many words talks about suicide, he slips in some sideways implications that would be like those who have the knowledge to rouse Leviathan. He calls down darkness upon the day of his birth, so that it would never be heard a son is born. He wishes he didn't exist. In other words, okay, outside of Job's predicament, it was good that Job existed. Job before would have said it was good that Job existed, and Job afterwards said it was good that Job existed. I dare say that Peter, before he betrayed Christ, said it was good that Peter existed, and after he repented, he also said the same. Judas didn't take that chance to take a look back afterwards, because he said, it would be better if I hadn't been born. And he killed himself. I don't know if I can argue that it's absolutely certain, but it certainly did so happen that he did kill himself.
Mm-hmm.
That to him, subjectively, it would be better if he had not been born at that moment, even if, as an objective matter of fact, it really was better that he lived, and he should have pushed through. He should have lived. He should have turned to Christ and repented. So I don't know. Does that make sense? Now, Christ knew he would not. That was known to him, just like he knew Judas would betray him.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not 100%. I'm following it. It sounds to me like what you're saying is, well, so first of all, okay, let me back up. It sounds to me like what you're saying is Jesus is saying that to Judas, he will feel as though it would have been better had he never been born, which is why then Judas goes on to kill himself, is because because Job expresses the same sentiment and considers killing himself as well. And I think that's plausible, but I also don't think that I don't think it's necessary. Even setting aside the reading I offered a minute ago, and that's because there's nothing even here in Matthew 26:23-24 that mentions final punishment being worse than non-existence, right? Verse 23, he who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes, it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. Notice there's no mention there of final punishment. There's nothing in the context here about final punishment. The context is just all about the betrayal. Mm-hmm. And it is, of course, the shame of having betrayed Jesus that prompts Judas to then try and undo what he'd done. Take the money back, Pharisees, right? And they refused. And so, Judas is like, well, shoot, it would be better if I'd never been born. I'm going to kill myself, right? Mm-hmm. So the point I'm getting at is, even setting aside what I said earlier and what you just said about the connection with Job and suicide, it seems as if Jesus may just be saying that the fact that it's not the final punishment of Judas that will be worse than had Judas never existed, but rather the fact of having betrayed Jesus, and probably the shame resulting from the knowledge of having done that, will be worse than having never existed.
Nicely put. Actually, you could say that's also the case with Mark 9's millstone, because it doesn't actually say hell will be even worse than that. It says it would be better to do that, to have that done to you rather, than to cause a little one to stumble.
Yes, but I will say, in pushing back against that,
Sure.
the very next verses are what might suggest that perhaps it is contrasting what's going to happen in hell, because the very next verse 43 of Mark 9 says, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life than to go to hell, right? Than with two hands to go enter life crippled, than with two hands to go to hell.
Yeah, good point.
But nevertheless, so I think there are several approaches to this passage that are very consistent with conditionalism. And meanwhile, we've identified some problems in Farrar's own understanding. Now, William, we have gone through a little over half of the clips that we'd planned, and we're already up to an hour and 3/4. How would you feel about stopping here as the end of part 4, and then continuing with the clips we've already prepared as part 5, say in 2 weeks or whenever we're next able? Would that be okay?
That's fine with me. That's certainly fine with me.
Okay, so
hopefully we'll go a bit faster next time.
Well, I mean, I don't feel all that pressured to go fast. I think this is great material worth interacting with, and even if we end up doing 10 parts, that's fine with me. Plus, it makes it easy to produce more content than have to go find other things to respond to. But just to give viewers a little bit of a teaser of some of the clips that we're going to talk about next time, we're going to be looking at places where Farrar claims that Fudge thinks to destroy means to annihilate, but then also in the very same video observes that actually Fudge says destroy and kill are basically synonymous. We'll also discuss Farrar's arguments against kill and destroy being synonymous in the context of Matthew 10:28. We'll also discuss Farrar's claim that destroy, at least as it's rendered in Matthew 10:28, actually communicates some concept of ruination. We'll look at Farrar's examples of Second Temple Jewish literature he thinks supports this ruination concept. So it'll all be, and then we'll also look a little bit around at Farrar's claim that words in the Basanas word group, so like basanizo, basanismas, this is destruction, destroy, whatever, that this word group refers to the sufferings of hell. So it'll be a very Matthew 10:28 heavy episode, it looks like, next week or next time we meet, which will be great. William, I'll sync with you offline to plan our next day, but I'll just say that my hope is that maybe we can do it in 2 weeks, but maybe not. I'll clear that up with you.
That'd be lovely.
The other thing I want to tease viewers with is completely unrelated to Rethinking Hell, but I want to mention it just because I'm excited about it, and that is a stream I'm going to do tomorrow on my own channel, The Apologetics. I am a lover of video games. I've played a lot of them, and a game is opening up in early access tomorrow that I've been longing for ever since it was announced, and it's called Grounded 2. And I won't say much about it. I won't say anything about it here now, but if people are not doing anything that requires their full attention, or that, they want to have another stream up featuring me tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific, I will be live streaming myself trying out this new game right after it's released. It'll be released an hour prior to that point, so it'll be very fresh. And I'm going to be starting a new series that I'll periodically return to if the stream is viewed much, if people like it, and I'm going to call the series Faith and Respawns, which is a play on the words faith and response, which is this Christian idea that the Christian faith demands a response on the part of the faithful. And I'm calling it Faith and Respawns because respawn is a common expression when an avatar dies in a video game, they can then respawn. Anyway, so what I'm going to try to do in this series is just enjoy video games I like playing, but at the same time, where appropriate, where it comes up, talk about Christian concepts, like, for example, the difference between a respawn and a resurrection, or whatever. So it might be an interesting way to sort of blend the gaming genre, the game streaming genre, with Christian theology and apologetics. And if nothing else, it'll be fun for me to play a game I'm excited to play. So if people are at all even curious about watching me try playing this game on stream, tune into my The Apologetics channel tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific, or you can watch it after it's archived in the channel, and I hope people will check it out. If I get enough views, see, here's my hope, is that beyond being a way for me to do something a little more productive with my video game time than I currently do, I also think it's possible that there will be people who will get exposed to Christian concepts and the gospel through me playing games and talking about Christian concepts while doing so, that might not have otherwise been exposed to Christian theology and stuff, especially, thoughtful, educated theological discussion, as opposed to some of the kinds you hear on more popular YouTubers. So I hope people will check it out. But if people aren't interested, I'll totally understand. Not everybody's a geeky gamer like I am, and no offense if people don't tune in. Any last words from you, William, before we bid our viewers adieu?
I think I'll let it go there, but thanks, guys. Look forward to seeing it. Well, you seeing me, I guess. Hearing me. There you go.
We'll see their chat. We'll see their chat when it happens. Yes. All right, well, folks, I will sync up with William about when we can next stream. If you are not subscribed to the YouTube channel and haven't clicked the notifications bell, now might be a good reason to do so, because that will be how you'll find out when we schedule our next stream. But I think there's at least a possibility that it'll be in 2 weeks, which would be Monday, August 11th. We'll see. I'll talk to William and see if that works. In any event, until then, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Man, look, maybe we should rethink this whole thing. I mean, you heard the guy.
The pains of eternal torment.
Yeah, I gotta rethink this whole thing.